Today, Mark Carney was sworn in as Canada's Prime Minister. He had a press conference. Rebel News was banned from the press conference. Shows you that the Carney prime ministership is off to the same start as the Trudeau one, censoring and silencing opponents. But here's some footage of Mark Carney talking. He was asked a question and he said, no, I don't want to talk about your questions. The news is standing behind me. No, that's not how it works, Mark. You can't say that what I tell you is the news. That's not really how it works in a democracy. The news is the news, and we get to ask whatever questions we want. One of them, which I think was on everyone's mind, is when will there be an election? And of course, to Mark Carney, who was selected, not elected, that question isn't particularly of concern. He said, well, for sure by November. Take a look.
Can I ask you what your plans are for the next few weeks? Are you going to be bringing back the House? Are you going to be calling an early election? And if so, when should Canadians expect to go to the polls?
Well, they certainly should expect to go to the polls before November. The news today is behind me. An exceptional group of individuals who are serving Canada, united, focused cabinet, focused on action, focused on the issues for Canadians. We are, as I said a moment ago, we will be going to take some decisions which directly meet some of the objectives I set out in my remarks, and we've been discussing.
It's so funny to joke about not having an election for months, having a prime minister that no one voted for, indeed that no one even knows about. But he did recognize that the media is very important here, and he sent a very blunt message to the CBC that if they do right by him, he'll do right by them. Take a look.
I'm complimenting the journalists from Radio-Canada, and I would like to compliment the very existence of Radio-Canada, and I'd like to reinforce that my government would be reinforcing. It goes back to Canadian identity, culture. This is away from the news, but the broader sense.
Yeah, that's pretty gross. Well, here's things that I think are news. I know Mark Carney might not think they're news, but I do. I think that we're dealing with what could be an illegitimate prime minister. I'm not saying it's impossible for someone who has not been elected to anything to be appointed PM. It's very irregular, but it's not illegal. But we don't know anything about the Liberal vote that made him leader. I suggest to you that it was, at the very least, questionable, if not fraudulent. We know that the Liberals boasted of having nearly 400,000 people register to vote, which is quite a lot. But fewer than about a third of them, 150,000, voted. 250,000 votes were rejected. On what basis? Who rejected them? Was there any scrutineering? How was this all done, given that it was online? So you had someone win with based on 150,000 votes out of 400,000. And remember that 14-year-old children could vote, foreign nationals could vote. Then we saw the fake debate. It was a love-in. They banned Ruby Dalla from coming, knowing she would ask some tricky questions. And of course, the vote count by district that showed laughable results that clearly aren't accurate. To say that Chrystia Freeland, even though we may not like her, to say she only got 188 votes in her own district, and Karina Gold only got 190 compared to massive numbers for Mark Carney, it's simply not believable. I think we have an illegitimate vote. And I think we have an illegitimate government for sure. To this day, Parliament has not been recalled. It's still prorogued. It has no popular support. It has no legal mandate. Mark Carney is a stranger. We don't even know where he lives, as in what country is he living in? We don't know anything about him. He certainly wasn't probed in any of the debates. And much of his media has either been very carefully selected with the state broadcaster, or he's gone down to the U.S. to do it. I think he's a kind of Manchurian candidate. I know one thing's for sure. Doesn't care about Western Canada. Only 2 of his cabinet ministers are west of Ontario. And this has immediate impact. For example, canola tariffs by China. Massive 100% tariffs on the canola industry, which is enormous. It's a Canadian industry. It's a Western Canadian industry, and it's much bigger than, let's say, the electric vehicle battery industry in Ontario and Quebec. But that's actually what China was retaliating for, Trudeau and now Carney are banning Chinese-made electric cars from Canada. And in return, China is punishing Canadian canola. Not even a statement that I can see, let alone tariffs in return. But that's because it's Canadian voters, not Western Canadian voters. Worse than that, Western Canadian farmers. I don't think there's 1 in 20 Western Canadian farmers who would vote Liberal. I mean, you've got to be senile or deranged to be a Saskatchewan farmer voting for the Liberals. So Mark Carney doesn't care, and of course, the media party doesn't care. Stephen Guilbeault, though, the extremist environmentalist minister under Trudeau, is now in charge of Quebec. So good luck with any pipelines there. But I think the craziest news I've heard today is not the cabinet. It's pretty much predictable. It's just picking over the tired cabinet from Justin Trudeau. The craziest thing I heard today was that Mark Carney is immediately going to leave Canada to go on a lengthy trip to Europe. What? What? We're in the worst and strangest trade battle of our recent memory with the United States. And instead of going down to Washington or to Mar-a-Lago, he's off to Europe? How does that make sense? Well, here's how I think it could make sense. Remember who Mark Carney is. He hasn't been in Canada for decades. He was the Bank of Canada governor, it's true. But then he became the Bank of England governor. And then he became a UN climate activist. And then he became the chairman of Brookfield Asset Management, which is like a mini version of the globalist BlackRock. But I think what you really need to know about Mark Carney is to know that he was a World Economic Forum member of the board. He was a Klaus Schwab board member. So he doesn't think of the world in terms of Canada. He thinks of the world in terms of a globalist project run by the World Economic Forum. So of course he's going to Europe. To do what? My speculation is that Mark Carney is going deliberately to Europe, not to the United States, because he's actually going to build a World Economic Forum coalition, an anti-Trump, anti-American coalition. Remember, Mark Carney and Brookfield have deep ties with Communist China, especially with Xi Jinping and the Communist Party. I think that Mark Carney, he's like an iceberg. We know about 1/7 that's above water, but most of it is below water. What has Mark Carney been doing in all these secretive meetings of the World Economic Forum, in his secretive meetings on behalf of the UN, on all of his projects? We don't really know, but what we do know is that he has made very high-level connections all around the world, transnational connections. And if anyone is the guy to build an anti-Trump global coalition, it's Mark Carney. I told you that when I went to the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland in January of 2024, so not 2 months ago, but 14 months ago, that the two words on everyone's lips were Elon Musk and Donald Trump. They were terrified by Trump disrupting the world order, and they knew that Elon Musk would allow Trump to disrupt the world order, and that came true. The World Economic Forum, well, Trump is the antidote to them. He's like garlic to a vampire. And that hits home for Mark Carney, the consummate globalist man. I think actually more than anyone, other than perhaps George Soros' son, Alex, who's doesn't really have the intellectual horsepower to do, he's more of a playboy. I think perhaps Mark Carney is the best positioned person in the world to put together an anti-Trump coalition. Not a politician in France or a politician in Estonia, or not someone small and small-minded, but someone who for decades has thought of himself as a citizen of the world and who went about doing schemes and plans behind the scenes under the radar. Remember, he has 3 passports. I think Mark Carney's actually just the guy to do it, by the way. I'm not saying he'll succeed, but I think that's his plan. He certainly has no plan to go to the United States. I think that Mark Carney is just as awful as Justin Trudeau, but he's smarter than Trudeau, he's harder working than Trudeau, and he is a much more powerful global network than Trudeau. I'm a little bit worried.